There's been a lot of talk lately about fake news, about liberal bias, and about the perceived political skewings of different news agencies. In most charts and opinions, however, they all seem to agree on what they perceive to be the least biased of all: PBS. It's partially government funded, doesn't air commercials like the rest of TV, and is decentralized enough that people tend to identify with their local PBS station rather than with the network as a whole. It gives us Sesame Street and American Experience, plus telethons and local events and pretty much anything that doesn't tend to make waves, unless a certain administration's feathers are ruffled. They are the ultimate face of bipartisan, which makes it so baffling when it comes under fire from right-wingers every once in a while, doesn't it? I mean, airing shows that happen to highlight the lives of people you don't know and likely don't even care about anyway. And yet, understanding why those perceptions are the case is a fascinating story into the forces that created PBS, as well as the forces that have threatened its existence from then on. So as PBS celebrates the 50th anniversary of its public debut, let's take a deep dive into the origins of PBS and the politics that made it what it is today. Before we can talk about what became public broadcasting, we should talk about broadcasting as a whole. Believe it or not, there was a lot of back and forth hand-wringing between companies and the federal government in the early days of radio. Before entering World War I, Woodrow Wilson ordered radio to be censored in the name of preserving neutrality. Then when the US finally entered into the war, the US Navy took control of 53 radio stations owned by one company, Marconi. This would lead to a legal battle that essentially stripped the last vestiges of control away from the British monopoly, and eventually led to the creation of RCA. RCA was near enough another monopoly, but hey, at least it was an American monopoly. Of course, they weren't really without competition. Hundreds of stations popped up across the country, many of which were set up at colleges and universities, but they were nowhere near as powerful in budget or in influence. They'd lobbied throughout the 20s and 30s for a more equitable share of radio space, including a failed amendment to the Communications Act of 1934, called the Wagner-Hatfield Amendment, which would have allocated over 25% of all radio facilities to nonprofits. Instead, the newly created FCC made it clear that since radio broadcasting was in the public interest, commercial broadcasters needed to devote at least some of their airtime to public affairs. This approach wasn't unheard of. After all, movie theaters regularly showed newsreels produced and distributed by major studios. In any case, this was the state of affairs when television emerged. While it took at least until World War II for television to become well known, it almost immediately took a lot of lessons from radio. TV wasn't nearly as monopolized, but it was experimental and expensive to get into. Those colleges that started in radio and would move to television as it matured usually got their money from cooperative grants, or sometimes in fact from advertising. All of that would begin to change in the 50s. In order to talk about this next phase, we need to discuss foundations and donor intent. Donor intent is a concept in philanthropy that centers on the stated purpose of a charitable gift, such as an endowment, and is explored in the law in the obligations, both implicit and explicit, that arise from that stated intent. For our purposes, we'll stick with the concept as applied to a private foundation, in which a wealthy donor endows a large sum of money to the foundation, which is then granted to various recipients by the foundation's trustees. These trustees may have entirely different visions and interpretations of the donor's original intent, and this can work positively or negatively. For example, let's look at the two foundations central to the story of public broadcasting, the Carnegie Corporation and the Ford Foundation. Andrew Carnegie wrote in his deed of gift establishing the Carnegie Corporation of New York, "Conditions upon earth inevitably change. Hence no wise man will bind trustees forever to certain paths, causes, or institutions. I disclaim any intention of doing so." Carnegie left his donor intent explicitly vague, which created some interesting problems after he passed away. In the 40s, the corporation funded a book called An American Dilemma, which helped lay the groundwork for racial integration. But they also ran a commission in sub-Saharan Africa that proposed solving poverty among white South Africans by segregating their black neighbors, a proposal among many that preceded the real policy of apartheid. Henry Ford and his son Edsel started the Ford Foundation, initially to support organizations in Michigan. Old Henry, of course, known for running an anti-Semitic newspaper, being cited by Adolf Hitler as an inspiration, and in a way helping popularize country music and the concept of Americana, would hardly seem on paper the kind of person to allow the kind of progressive things the Ford Foundation would eventually do. It was only after Edsel and eventually Henry passed away that the Foundation's trustees set out to expand their reach and fund larger projects. Basically, these two foundations set examples for the limitations and sometimes contradictory aims that can come about from the inherent structure of a private foundation. I bring this up because the aims and past deeds of a corporation are not ultimately important for discussions like this. The name recognition is important, and it's often the only thing outside people can grasp when talking about them, but ultimate control rests within the decisions of the people made within them. One of the Ford Foundation's first national contributions in 1952 was the creation of what was eventually called NET. Originally called the Educational Television and Radio Center, it started out as a privately run distributor of educational programs that were produced by a growing alliance of local stations across the country. Throughout the 50s, not much happened in a larger scope, which makes sense. The 50s were a time of relative economic stability, or at least that's the way it was presented to us in pop culture. ETRC themselves tended to receive rather dull, long-winded programming aimed at adult academics. Since they were non-commercial, local stations tended to be low-budget and low in entertainment value. It was only after moving from Ann Arbor, Michigan, close to Ford's headquarters, to New York City that the network started going on the offensive. 3 major networks existed by the end of the 50s, and leadership at the renamed National Educational Television and Radio Center wanted to take the title of the elusive 4th network. To that end, they helped a nearby station, WNTA Channel 13, to go non-commercial after a years-long battle to keep it from moving out of New Jersey. In return, CBS donated a studio in Midtown Manhattan, where NET and Channel 13 would set up to put their plan into action. We all ought to know what happened in the 60s by now. A lot of things happened.
My country is full of lies. We all gonna die and die like flies. I don't trust nobody.
And with NET seeking ways to boost their credibility, they were determined to let the country know in their own little way what it really meant. Bolstered by successes importing shows from the BBC, as well as the New Frontier rhetoric of Kennedy and the Great Society rhetoric of Johnson, NET began staking claims through documentaries.
This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.
The U.S. and the UN backed the authority of the central government. Civil war broke out.
The surgeon's hands and the surrounding area will be completely isolated in a totally sterile environment.
The Freedom Riders have recently encountered this American dilemma.
Who does the Negro think he is?
By the time new regular shows began, these documentaries took deep dives into serious social issues like poverty and foreign policy. Even with relatively small audiences, these documentaries in a way began creating serious interest in local public affairs. Wait, poverty? Foreign policy? Public affairs?
Sounds like a liberal bias to me.
And local stations were not happy about this. Naturally, because it was the 60s and racism never really went away, but they couldn't really do much about it because NET was a network. And even though it was non-commercial, it still had a good amount of power over its affiliates. Then came a very public reevaluation. At this point, NET was a full-on production studio on top of being an alliance of local networks. It was looking more and more like a traditional corporate outfit, just without commercials. This despite the fact that they were sharing space with one particular affiliate, Channel 13, which was producing most of these documentaries, under the control of a troublemaker named Joan Gantz Cooney. Don't get ahead of me now. This was at the time the FCC had in place something called the Fairness Doctrine, which meant that broadcasters were required to air controversial topics with equal and fair consideration to all sides. Actual standards of this doctrine were vague, but believe it or not, the two biggest enforcements of this law came down against conservatives. The FCC went down on a radio show called Christian Crusade in Pennsylvania, attacking the author of a book on Barry Goldwater. And WLBT in Mississippi had its license revoked for actively censoring civil rights news and promoting segregation repeatedly on air. Since NET was privately run, it could absolutely have suffered from FCC pushback under the wrong administration. So, two studies were set about by the Carnegie Corporation to be finished up in 1967. The first, led by Joan Gantz Cooney, compiled opinions across the country on the prospect of using television to teach preschoolers, especially underprivileged ones. The second, commissioned by the federal government, looked into the future of educational television, and after 2 years put out a report. It observed that commercial television for the public and instructional television for academics were the most extreme possible sides of television, and that in the middle should exist something called public television, which the committee defined to include as all that is of human interest and importance, which is not at the moment appropriate or available for support by advertising, and which is not arranged for formal instruction. Central to their recommendation was a federally chartered corporation for public television, to be charged with funding programs and facilities. Other suggestions included the creation of a second production facility in addition to NET, as well as a system for interlinking stations for live network broadcasts. This was before they were a proper network. Many of these suggestions were drafted into the Public Television Act of 1967. With the support of Congress, a hastily pasted change in the wording, and a signature by President Johnson, the Public Broadcasting Act was set in motion. At first, it didn't mean much to NET as an organization. It was now co-owned by the new Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but they continued on with shows like NET Journal and Public Broadcast Laboratory, which continued on keeping conservatives up at night. The next year, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood went national with funding from the Sears Roebuck Foundation, and NET created, as an autonomous unit, the Children's Television Workshop. Something happened. A lot happened.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
To judge the entire police department by the alleged action of a few would be just as unfair.
That the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
The nation came into 1969 shocked and shaken. Conservatives came back into power. As far as most observers were concerned, the civil rights movement was over. Hey, at least Nixon got to call himself a peacemaker, right?
We cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another, until we speak quietly enough so that our words can be heard, as well as our voices.
Okay, clearly NET is a target now, right? I mean, those cries of liberal bias now have a voice in the White House. Not only that, but a voice with decades of grudges by that point. NET themselves weren't deterred, but their masters certainly were. Okay, pause. Let's get our bearings here. So, the founding of PBS is just around the corner now, but it's buried in the middle of 2 years of chaotic and fuzzy politics. So if you want that climactic moment, let's pin the agreed upon founding date of PBS right here, and give it some fanfare. Okay, back to work. Johnson's administration suggested $20 million for the next round of funding before he left office. Right away, Nixon proposed cutting that in half, just a year into the Corporation for Public Broadcasting's life and before it really produced anything. A 2-day hearing at the turn of May was the only thing standing in the way of the final amount.
I was a little critical yesterday, and more so than I should have been.
I enjoy it very, very much. And I think your programming is excellent. The kind of people that you bring to discuss some of the issues of the day, all of high caliber.
Enter one Fred Rogers and the testimony heard around the world.
We deal with such things as as the inner drama of childhood. We don't have to bop somebody over the head to make him, to make drama on the screen. We deal with such things as getting a haircut, or the feelings about brothers and sisters, and the kind of anger that arises in simple family situations.
Could we get a copy of this so that we can see it? Maybe not today, but I'd like to see the program.
I'd like very much for you to see.
I'd like to see the program itself, or any one of them, you see. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
It's no secret that Nixon and his staff hated the media. But as to the true extent of his administration's attempts to undermine public broadcasting, we have a FOIA request put out by the Second Carnegie Commission later that decade to thank for the information that we have. Memos among White House staffers and CPB board members detailed what happened next. On November 3rd, 1969, the same day PBS was founded and just a week before Sesame Street would debut, a memo was prepared for Nixon.
In accordance with your instructions, I made it clear that the proposed increase in the funding for the corporation was contingent upon the creation of new program production facilities to replace national educational television. It was agreed that while NET would be used until the new facilities are in operation, the funding would decrease to zero over the next 2 or 3 years. Government funding of CPB should not be used for the creation of anti-administration programming.
10 days later, Vice President Spiro Agnew made this speech.
Perhaps the place to start looking for a credibility gap is not in the offices of the government in Washington, but in the studios of the networks in New York.
But what can you really expect from a man whose name, rearranged, spells grow a penis?
Also, Grandma, this dragon is not named Spiro. So basically, Nixon was on board with a plan to create this new entity, the Public Broadcasting Service, explicitly to replace NET. You know, if conservatives want a patriotic story for PBS, I think its creation harkens back to a seminal moment in American history, the Constitutional Convention. Held in secret while a system already existed for the purpose of creating a new system to take its place, and then siphon off its authority and absorb its identity, forever pretending it was the real power all along. Kind of reminds me of World Wrestling too, now that I think about it. Except in the case of PBS, it was made to appease a higher authority by making things decentralized rather than centralized. That congressional hearing was certainly an embarrassment for the executives involved, and with NET at the center of everything, they felt something had to happen. Remember that NET shared a facility in New York with WNDT, and both were part-owned by the Ford Foundation. So in conjunction with the CPB, they threatened to cut off funding from NET unless it merged with WNDT and let PBS take its place. That finally happened in June of 1970, making its way for the old distribution network to officially rebrand itself. The public finally got to see its results on October 5th with its first official sign-on.
This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service.
By this time, Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers were both household names, launched into critical acclaim under NET, and while Nixon got his wish for a more a more decentralized system, it will not be the end for Nixon's gripes with public broadcasting. The newly merged WNET would still make the same documentaries as ever for at least 2 more years, since they still got the NET branding. But this time there would be no guarantee that any particular one would make it outside their own station. The Children's Television Workshop, now fully independent, did its best to secure funding for merchandise and other licensing arrangements almost immediately. The story of Sesame Street, of course, is much richer, more detailed, and much less politically loaded than that of PBS, so we'll set them aside for the rest of this piece. That same year, Nixon created the Office of Telecommunication Policy, which would be the base of operations for their little conspiracy for the next few years. They talked in memos and letters about every possible way to curb any sort of anti-government speech on PBS. Some of the things they said about doing include loading the board of directors for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with Republican and moderate executives, trying and failing to censor debate on guaranteed minimum income, trying and failing to prevent a former staffer from suggesting guaranteed minimum income while trying to take credit, trying and failing to make CBB cut back on public affairs shows on multiple occasions, vetoing a funding renewal bill in 1972, essentially putting PBS right back where it started, forcing CBB executives to resign so they can elect their own puppet leaders, laid out in a letter with the ominous postscript,
"Welcome to the new public television."
Nixon won re-election in a landslide, an unprecedented victory. But even as the incumbent victor was celebrating, something caught the public's eye.
We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
Washington was stirring with activity. The major commercial networks caught on to the importance of this, but they were too bogged down in their traditional programming to air more than a couple hours of coverage a day. PBS had no such limits. They began airing it constantly, live in the day, rerun at night. Nixon's OTP tried to stop it, but it was too late. Watergate was here, and PBS was at the forefront. Despite convincing the Ford Foundation to exit from public TV, Nixon's trusted director of OTP, Clay Whitehead, pushed support for a new long-term funding bill and peaced out, just in time for Nixon to finally be pushed into a corner.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
A couple important takeaways from the Nixon years. Nixon did everything he could to undermine public television. He made it very clear, as did his fellow Republicans, that anything to do with public affairs and social issues were in his mind inherently out to taint America with liberal bias. The entire premise of public television as he saw it was to not step out of line, to promote safe, unchallenging forms of education and public arts with no political baggage. His supporters promoted an ideal form for this structure, a conglomerate of local stations as decentralized as possible, creating their own programs, and puppeteered by a board of directors designed to be bipartisan, but able to be reined in by a smart president. And it would have worked perfectly, if not for the people who actually worked there. His appointed board members constantly undermined him. The individual stations kept putting out documentaries on social issues. Shows like Sesame Street, with their conscious efforts to integrate their cast and crew, spoke profoundly to people in underprivileged groups. And in the end, the efforts to expose and quash an imagined conspiracy ended up exposing and quashing his own real conspiracy. The legacy of politics creating public television is that by creating this system, it paradoxically reflects the platform of the people in power, while at the same time giving people a means to challenge that platform through education and public affairs. Richard Nixon was destroyed by his own creation. Take a look at this graph. Guys, this joke was funny when it came out 20 years ago. Please stop.
Look at this graph!
This graph. This is the amount of federal appropriations given to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting compared to recommendations published in the White House's annual budget. Each dip and gap has a story to tell. We've just gone over the chaos in these first 5 years, so let's keep moving on. Right here was the work of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Ford signed a 5-year extension and helped put into place the means to appropriate 2 years ahead of time, which essentially created a lag in the rest of this chart. In 1979, the Carnegie Corporation came back with a new commission, the one we mentioned before with the FOIA request. They suggested in their report, among other things, that the CPB should be replaced, split into a public telecommunications trust and a program services endowment. Carter, having already proposed a simpler realignment plan to Congress, paid it no mind. The CPB themselves chose to create a program services fund shielded within itself. That same year, incidentally, one of Nixon's OTP staffers came back to create C-SPAN, run by cable providers with a narrow focus on raw, uncut Washington politics. Here, we get into the Reagan years.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Kind of self-explanatory.
The Reagans were never interested in children. Really, I mean, it was the only administration that never paid any attention.
And you can see the Congress really reined in his demands as well. Things climbed up during Bush Sr. and Clinton, but right here, that second term, that was the work of somebody's favorite, Newt Gingrich.
Well, my question is, what is a tax-supported institution doing publishing a poll? I mean, what is PBS doing using tax money to lobby the American people to send them more tax money? The only group lobbying are a small group of elitists who want to tax all the American people so they get to spend the money. And I would just suggest to you that that's silly, that if they would quit spending the money on polling and spend the money on privatizing themselves, they would find there's a good market for them. They would go out into the marketplace and they'd do fine. In the liberal world where all money is free because it comes from taxpayers, therefore let's have everything. That poll may make sense, but I'm frankly offended at the idea that PBS is using tax money to run around the country to make publicity and to lobby to keep itself getting tax money. I think that's an example of what's wrong with the current PBS system.
Despite not nearly going as far as they wanted to, intending to completely defund public broadcasting, it dropped a fair bit. Now, what's this gap right here in the White House's recommendations? Well, it turns out that the Bush administration hated CPB so much that they just outright refused to give any numbers for those. This, of course, was when TV was moving to digital. Sesame Workshop created PBS Kids, and half of all public stations failed to meet the 2003 deadline to go digital. During the Obama years, Mitt Romney said this:
I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS. I'm going to stop other things. I like PBS. I love Big Bird. I actually like you too. But I'm not going to keep on spending money on things to borrow money from China to pay for.
And then, of course, finally at the end, we have So that was the entire 50-year history of a major network, plus the 50 years leading up to it, summarized in however long it took to say. Public broadcasting is, in principle, a compromise between governments and the creators, journalists, and fundraising partners that set out to defy the entropy of capitalism and give their fellow citizens one more source of information. It's important for such an arrangement to not just run amok, to not betray the trust of people who are ultimately paying for it. But it's just as important to not shy away from situations where one side of the aisle might hold most or all of the valid arguments, where the best sides of a debate can emerge from throwing away arguments based on unresearched claims or outright lies. PBS will always be a conservative punching bag, because it was created to be one.
But in a poetic twist, the argument in favor of keeping local stations mostly autonomous does expose probably one of the best things about it. Your local station, in a way, is yours. Every station has a special history unto itself, and many have a large library of shows, past and present, that tap into the essence of their communities. If you haven't already, consider looking at what your station has to offer, and for more info on the finer details of public broadcasting, check out the links in the description. They've been invaluable to this episode, and thank you so much for watching.